As Scott mentioned, I was involved since October 2002 with the National Bicentennial Commission. My tribe appointed me to be a member of the Circle of Tribal Advisors. So to talk about Lewis and Clark, I'm not a historian. I'm a law professor. I teach Indian law, which I have since 1993, and practiced Indian law, and I'm a judge for a tribe in Oregon. In fact, I'm here this week because I'm teaching at your law school for a week about economic development issues in Indian country. So the first question I asked myself when I got involved with Lewis and Clark, well, I'm not a historian. What can I say about Lewis and Clark? What might I know about them? Well, I'm going to talk to you about an international law principle that today we call the doctrine of discovery. So there's the pun in my title. American Indians weren't lost, were they? As we well know, it was Lewis and Clark who were wandering around, not quite sure where they were. They stopped every Indian they saw and said, what's around the next bend? What's over there? Where might we buy a horse or two? So they were the ones that were lost. So it's kind of ironic that today we call this legal principle the doctrine of discovery. So way back in October 2002, I thought, what can I write about Lewis and Clark? How would I get involved with them? And so I asked myself, would Thomas Jefferson have known about the doctrine of discovery? Europeans going to other continents and countries, sticking their flag and their cross in the soil, and then claiming rights over the people and the lands there. You've seen those same paintings I've had. Columbus, John Cabot along our northeastern part of the United States, Champlain, Joliet, Marquette, all those Frenchmen that came down the Mississippi River. What they always do, flag and cross in the soil. Now what's the caption to most of those paintings? Usually they tell you the explorers are thanking God for a safe voyage across the ocean. Well, maybe. They're probably pretty glad they didn't fall off the edge of something, right? But folks, I'm here to tell you, and I'll prove to you in a little bit, that they were engaged in a legal procedure, a formalistic act to prove that they had arrived there. They were the first Europeans, the first Christian people, and they were claiming rights over the native lands and the native people. They knew there were native people, but they were claiming superior rights that were recognized under international law and are still recognized, really, under international law today. What I'm talking to you about is the original principle of federal Indian law today. The doctrine of discovery is not just some interesting old historical thing that happened 400 years ago for Indian tribes and Indian people. And we'll talk about that later. I'll have to walk over here to work this thing. So I'm going to start you with a teaser question. What did the United States buy from France in the Louisiana Purchase? You see all that land there in yellow. I guess forget that part and forget this, but everything west of the Mississippi, we made a transaction with France, right? We paid them $15 million. How many of you have heard the phrase that we paid 3 cents an acre for all the land? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to tell you that's false. You just learned something that 99.9% of Americans don't know, and I'll show you in a few moments. If Thomas Jefferson was alive today, he would laugh at every historian, and even Stephen Ambrose, and every historian who writes about the Louisiana Purchase and Jefferson and Lewis and Clark. They repeat this falsehood that the United States purchased the land from France. We did not. And it's going to take me a while to get to prove to you or to make my point about what we did buy from France. But it wasn't the land, folks. And you already know in the back of your mind the facts that prove this. We signed the Louisiana Purchase Treaty in 1803. What did we spend the next 100 years doing against the tribes in the Louisiana Territory? We engaged in some negotiations, some political interactions, some warfare, didn't we? We signed over 100 treaties with tribes in the Louisiana Territory area. And we paid those tribes money and farming goods and clothing and food for something, for the actual title to the land. We only bought the title from the tribes when we then signed treaties with them. And as you well know, there's still 100 tribes and reservations in that area. So the tribes did not agree to sell all their land to the United States, even in these treaty sessions. So what did we buy? And then what we're interested in is, what did Thomas Jefferson know about this status? Why did I say he would laugh if he was alive today, if he were to read that we paid just $15 million, just 3 cents an acre for that? So that's what I'm going to talk about. And especially since so many of you are here from the Lewis and Clark chapter, I'm going to try to emphasize more information about Lewis and Clark today than I might normally do in a talk just to the general public. Since the Missoulian said I called Jefferson what did the paper say I called him? A conniving...
Did you?
I mean, it's in quotes, so I guess I did, but how would I say that about my dear president, Thomas? Yeah, it's right towards the end of the article, but yeah, I said something, he was a conniving character. Well, I'll see if you agree with me when I get done. Mostly you'll have to buy my book, though, and read it, because I have 2 chapters on Jefferson, and the reason I said that about him, and so I'll mention this briefly. Thomas Jefferson talked a good game about a lot of things, and he then acted 180 degrees different. If you've read the book that won, I think, the Pulitzer Prize, The American Sphinx by Joseph Ellis, about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, very interesting book. And the reason he called him, and the title of the book is American Sphinx, is you couldn't read Jefferson. What he said and wrote isn't necessarily what he then really did. Now, what Jefferson wrote about American Indians, folks, was that they were the equal of the white man. Jefferson said, your blood and ours will mix one day, and you are our equal. He literally thought tribal people had better governments even, had the best governments in the world. Now, he said that's because they have no government. Well, that shows his ignorance also, right? No society, no group of people can exist without some sort of control and leadership and just community and culture, right? So Jefferson didn't understand as much as he thought he did. But while he's telling Indian people, our blood's going to mix one day and we are brothers, you will live with us, he didn't act that way, did he? He drove Indians away as fast as he could. He bought their lands as fast as he could. And I'll show you in a few moments. Let's talk about it now then. Jefferson was literally the father of what's called the removal era of Indian policy. The Trail of Tears, we all know that phrase, don't we? We always associate President Andrew Jackson with the removal period. The bayonets, armored troop, or U.S. Army going into the South and driving the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminoles, etc., west of the Mississippi. We always think that was Andrew Jackson. Well, he was president when that policy occurred. But guess who first wrote about it? President Jefferson, my good buddy. In 1803, he wrote 3 private letters to 2 generals and to William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of the Indiana Territory at that time. And Jefferson says, and he literally writes in the letter, this is not for public consumption. He said, but we all know that all the Indians will have to move west of the Mississippi someday. Wait a minute, didn't he just say we're all going to be brothers and our blood is going to mingle and we'll all live together? So which Jefferson was telling the truth? So that's, I guess, my comment about conniving, but I don't think I ever said that. But I'm quoting. Okay, so.
Devious.
Maybe it's what?
Devious and conniving.
Oh my God, devious and conniving. That's terrible. El Diablo. Okay, this is the first major Indian law case that the United States Supreme Court decided. And this is the class we start teaching the subject called federal Indian law. Johnson v. McIntosh. I can describe this case to you very easy. It's a simple case of trespass. Mr. Johnson's grandfather was part of a company in 1773 and 1775 who went through the woods of what's now Illinois and Indiana, and they were looking for Indian people that would sign a piece of paper and sell them some land. So they bought hundreds of thousands of acres, allegedly, from Indian chiefs right in the woods. His grandfather was a British citizen. There was no United States then. Remember, this was 1773 and 1775. Mr. McIntosh gets some of the same land in 1818. He purchases it directly from the United States, who signed a treaty with these same tribes, the Illinois and Piankashaw tribes, in, of course, what is now the state of Illinois. Mr. Johnson brings a trespass lawsuit. He wants to eject Mr. McIntosh from land that he claims his grandfather bought 50-some years ago. This simple question that the Supreme Court is faced with is, how do you buy Indian lands? Do tribes own the full fee simple title? Now, folks, you and I, when we own our homes, if we're not on an Indian reservation and we're not Indians, we own what is called the fee simple absolute title. That's absolute ownership of the property. We allegedly have the rights to do almost anything with that property. If you want to give it to your kids for $1, you can do that. If you can trick your neighbor into paying you $10 million for it, congratulations. But can Indian tribes sell their land? And that is all this case is about. This case is written by our most famous Chief Justice, John Marshall, and this is the first of 3 cases that he wrote that are called the Marshall Trilogy. And they establish the basis of federal Indian law today. When we start federal Indian law, it's with these 3 cases by John Marshall, and if we start with Johnson v. McIntosh. So what happened to Indian tribes? How did Marshall decide this? What he says, this country was settled on discovery and conquest. So that's the title of my book, Native America Discovered and Conquered. I wanted to put like quotes around the words discovered and conquered, and my publisher told me no. And in fact, I even wanted to change the title at the end. I thought we were just doing a working title. I found out that an author has no power whatsoever. They told me, no, the marketing department likes that title, that's what it's staying. And I've been criticized by a few Indian people for using the words discovered and conquered in the title, because they say, I wasn't discovered, I wasn't lost. As we started with, it's Lewis and Clark that were lost, and I wasn't conquered. But I took those 2 words directly from Johnson v. McIntosh. That's what the United States Supreme Court says happened when Europeans walked ashore and put their flag and their cross in the soil. They were claiming rights, folks, rights over the native people. Now, where did such an audacious and ridiculous, in fact, my standard joke here is I asked someone in the front row, where do you live, sir? Coming over to your house tonight? Got a flag and a cross. Now, what's he going to do? Got his rifle, you know, or 911. There's an idiot out here thinks he can claim my property. Too bad Indians didn't have 911 in 1606 when the Virginia settlers came ashore, or 1620 when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this opinion goes into an interesting statement of history, folks, and where Europeans came up with this idea that they could claim superior rights over other people. And so the court, Chief Justice John Marshall, recounts a history that all our founding fathers understood and all our founding fathers would have studied when they went to school. Where did this idea come from that European Christians could claim rights of other people? So he takes us back in time to when Spain and Portugal developed the technology to start sailing out of the sight of land. What did they start finding? Well, the Cape Verde Islands, the Azores, and the Canary Islands off the coast of Portugal and Spain, and then Portugal starts sailing down the west coast of Africa. Well, they want ownership rights. They want to be able to control the people. And so the King of Portugal, King Duarte, in 1436, finally convinces the Pope to issue a papal bull. That's a funny word, yes, I know. We might say, well, that's bull. Papal bulls are edicts, orders of the church. So the Pope in 1436 grants the King of Portugal the right to colonize and control the Canary Islands, to Christianize these wild, heathen, savage people who lived there. Now the Pope didn't agree at first. It's kind of funny because the king said, well, wait, if you let me control these islands, I will convert them and I will increase the earthly flock of the one true church. How can any pope resist that argument? It must have been Duarte's attorneys that helped him with that argument. Because it was just great. So the Pope granted this ownership right. So over the next few decades, Portugal, is going down the west coast of Africa. Isn't that called the Horn of Africa? And they want rights over what they're finding. Gold, trade, spices, slaves. So what do? They turn to Pope Nicholas V. In 1453 and 1455, Pope Nicholas issues more papal bulls, granting Portugal the right to explore, conquer, and acquire title, sovereignty, and jurisdiction. That's the kind of authority that it was assumed the Pope had even to control the conduct of earthly princes. Well, Spain felt left out of this. We don't have any papal bulls. So when Columbus shows up and says, I think I can go that way, and I think I can find lands, then Isabella and Ferdinand listened. Isabella hawked her jewels to finance Columbus, and they sent him forth under a charter that said, you'll be the admiral of any lands for which you acquire from us. And we want you to acquire sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. The moment Columbus returns with this news that, yes, I did find new lands, and these people don't speak our language, they aren't Christian, they're savages, they have no clothes, no food, no laws, no money. I mean, this is the standard statement of indigenous peoples around the whole world, whether it's Africa, South America, North America, whatever. This was the justification for European Christians to assume some sort of God-granted dominance. So the new pope is Pope Alexander VI. Isabella and Ferdinand send their lawyers to him, and they say, give us a papal bull now, like you've been giving Portugal. So in 1493, in May, folks, the Pope issues 3 bulls. You can read them online today. Inter Caetera Divinia 1 and 2, and he divides the world in half. He draws a line from the North Pole to the South Pole, granting Portugal all rights east of that line to explore, conquer, and acquire title, sovereignty, and jurisdiction, and granting Spain those same rights west of that line. Explore, conquer, acquire sovereignty, title, and jurisdiction. Folks, what language do they speak in Brazil?
Portuguese.
What language in all the rest of the New World?
Spanish.
Spanish. Well, is that just an accident? Go home and look at your globe tonight. Brazil's that part of South America that sticks away the heck out into the Atlantic. It fell over that line the Pope took. Any earthly prince that would interfere with this division, this papal bull, would be excommunicated. Now, this history I'm telling you, in this case, this is what the United States Supreme Court used to determine what the law was in 1773 that controlled a British citizen's purchase of Indian lands in North America. Wow. Now that's some chutzpah, isn't it? Or someone told me I don't say that right. Chutzpah and hubris. To think you can give away the lands of other people. This case is still the law today, folks. American Indian tribes that own trust lands, the 7 federally recognized tribes right here in Montana, they cannot sell their land, they cannot lease their land, they cannot develop their land without the permission of the Secretary of Interior. Why? Johnson v. McIntosh. Our very first Congress, July the 22nd, 1790, enacted a federal statute that is still the law today, that no tribe or nation or band of Indians or any Indian person can sell their lands without the permission of the United States. That's still the law today. So we're not talking about just kind of interesting stuff that happened in our past. We're talking about international law that still applies. Folks, what did Russia do on August the 2nd last year? Where did they plant their flag? Bottom of the Arctic Ocean, not on the North Pole, at the bottom of the ocean, 2.5 miles down. Now, an American planted an American flag at the North Pole in 1908. Wasn't that Richard Byrd or somebody like that? You can go online right now and see blog people who are outraged that Russia did this because they'll say, we planted our flag there 100 years ago. Folks, what did we stick our flag in 1908?
Ice.
Ice. And that's water. And international law has never allowed any country to claim the oceans. There's always been free passage and free fishing rights on the ocean. So regrettably, that American stuck his flag on ice. Russia goes to the bottom, 2.5 miles Go online, you can see this too. The flag is like it's rippling in the wind. I didn't know there were winds at the bottom of the ocean. But anyway, it's a pretty little Russian flag. Now folks, they didn't do this just for a joke, did they? Russia is claiming 10 billion tons of oil and gas that is estimated to be under the North Pole. Russia's trying to prove its claim through the UN. There's a treaty that most countries have signed. We have not. This treaty was enacted in 1982 and the Reagan administration refused to sign it. It's called the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So there's a pretty definite set out way to claim underwater rights through the UN. Russia's trying to prove this claim. They failed once already in 2002 through the UN. If they can't prove their claim, do you think they're going to say that flag means something? Why is the American flag on the moon? Is it just pride and we put our flag there? Those moon rocks that we brought home, if they had been solid gold, what would we have done with them? Given them to the New World to share with the poor countries of the world? Probably not. Okay, this history I'm telling you folks, and let me tell you a little more history that is in this case too, because I digress there. But the day I was at a conference up in Washington when the Russians planted their flag, and someone in the audience had to tell me I hadn't heard about it. I about fell over. So I ran back to the hotel, wrote an editorial that got published in the Los Angeles Times. Discovery in the modern world. We just didn't know and think there was anything new to find, right? Now, lots of countries are exploring off of Antarctica. Quiet. Looking for oil and gas under the ocean. The race is on for the North Pole. The moment Russia claimed that, Denmark, Canada, and the United States all sent naval flotillas up there, just sort of to reassert our presence there. You're going to read more about that. And I think it may end up with an argument over discovery and whose flag was first and what did Richard Byrd put his flag in. Very interesting. Okay, folks, to get more to America, King Henry VII was a Catholic monarch in 1496 when he was thinking of sending John Cabot out to make some explorations. England was very jealous that the whole world had been divided from Portugal and Spain. So Henry VII gets his attorneys together. Remember, the attorneys are always the good guys in these stories. And they tweak the idea of the papal bulls. And they tell Henry VII, if we go where no other Christian prince has yet been, if we go where Spain and Portugal have not yet made it, we've got to be able to claim those areas, and the Pope will not, cannot consider that a violation of his order. So in 1496, John Cabot gets sent forth by Henry VII to look, and I can quote you the language, folks. It says, go where no Christian prince has yet been, period, close quote. Don't get me excommunicated, but get me some land and gold and timber and whatever else might be out there. So John Cabot explores our coast of North America from Newfoundland as far south as Virginia, and maybe even a little further south. And then from those explorations, one little guy rowing ashore and going ploop, ploop, England claimed the continent. Even though the French were claiming they were here, the Spanish were claiming they were here, England claimed the continent. This is mentioned in Johnson and Mackintosh. Well, by the time of Henry VII's granddaughter, Elizabeth I, of course, England is not a Catholic country anymore. Elizabeth is, in fact, already excommunicated. So you would think she wouldn't care about these papal bulls at all. But she recognizes what is sort of developing international law. That's what the doctrine of discovery is. I mean, what's international law, folks? It's the procedures that governments recognize as controlling their conduct. And the doctrine of discovery is really the very first formulation of international law. You take an international law class in law school today, they'll start with discovery. They'll read Spanish writings from the 1530s. You'll read these papal bulls, and you'll analyze how governments came to kind of control their conduct. If someone did arrive first and do that, okay, you take that area. We'll go 500 miles down here, and that's ours. So that's exactly what Henry VII told John Cabot to do, and that's exactly what Queen Elizabeth I chartered Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert to do in 1587. when they attempted the first English settlements in North America. Where'd she tell them to go? Same place her grandfather told Cabot to go. Go where no Christian prince has yet been, that's quote unquote, and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. She complied with this emerging international law idea that where Christian Europeans went, they could make claims. Then, of course, her successor, James I, who then established the first permanent English colony of Jamestown, Virginia, he charters the Virginia Company in 1606 to come here and create an English colony. Where do you think he tells them where to go? You following a trend here? Go where no Christian prince has yet been. And he adds, convert these heathen savages who as of yet live in darkness of the one true God. So he adds a religious component to it, which really had been there all along too, right? Hadn't Portugal, the Portuguese king in 1436 said, I will convert these Canary Islanders and increase the earthly flock. So there had been certain elements developed. Now folks, so that I don't forget this, let me tell you what Lewis and Clark did. Well, you all folks know, I just learned, I'm from Oregon. I thought I was east of the Continental Divide here. I'm not, right? That darn river flows the wrong direction, doesn't it? It's still flowing west, right? So we've not crossed the Continental Divide. You guys are part of what was the Oregon country, right? So Lewis and Clark crossed the Rocky Mountains. Now you start hearing them talk about using the branding iron. Meriwether Lewis took a branding iron with him. How many of you are backpackers? You like to go on 28-month backpack trips and carry a 5-pound brass branding iron? I'm going to build up my quads. Carry a little smedal around with them. You can see that branding iron today. It's at the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. It says U.S.CAPT M. Lewis. I've read the journals pretty carefully. You hardly see the branding iron mentioned while they're east of the Rocky Mountains. They know they're in American territory or American claimed territory while they're still in Louisiana. They cross the Rockies, all 7 men who are writing journals. And many of us forget there were 4 sergeants and Private Joseph Whitehouse wrote journals too. All 5 of them wrote, we are now leaving the United States. They knew they were going to an area that had not yet been sufficiently acquired by just one European or American government. Now you hear the branding iron referred to a dozen times. And Clark does most of the writing for he and Lewis out there, and he says, I and the men carved our names. Captain Lewis branded his. What were they doing, folks? Just tourist stuff? Kilroy was here. They were an official military expedition ordered by President Jefferson to go where? Just to the Pacific Ocean? No, to the mouth of the Columbia River. And why the mouth of the Columbia River? Most of you know an American discovered the Columbia River first. We think in 1792. Robert Gray sails 25 miles up the mouth of the Columbia River, names it after his own boat. He was sailing in the Columbia Rediviva, and he proclaims it to the world. Jefferson was Secretary of State in 1792. He knew exactly where the mouth of the Columbia River was. Most of you have seen the map that Lewis and Clark crossed the continent with. Very detailed back east, a little vague up to the Mississippi, blank, 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 and there's 25 miles of the Columbia River. Perfectly charted, just the way Oregon and Washington go. Jefferson's target was the mouth of the Columbia River. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Man, I'm still on this case, aren't I? Have I recounted enough history? This idea, I said I was going to talk to you about Lewis and Clark. So they brand their names. They write their names. When William Clark takes a few men, they're at the coast, and they go up the Long Beach Peninsula on the state of Washington, the furthest point north in Washington, at least the ocean. What does he do? Well, of course, he carves his name on a tree. U.S. Captain William Clark from the United States. The date, I think, November 19, 1805. Tourist stuff? Absolutely not, folks. Making claims to the territory. It's better to carve your name on a tree than to stick a flag in a cross in the soil. But let me tell you something interesting so I don't forget this later. The War of 18, then we built Fort Astoria, right? John Jacob Astor, I'll talk about him a little bit later. But John Jacob Astor builds the first permanent American trading post on the Pacific. Where does he go? The mouth of the Columbia River. He writes President Jefferson a letter in 1808, and Astor was very smart. He was obviously working Jefferson for some money. And he says, President Jefferson, I'm thinking of building a trading post out there in the west on the Pacific Ocean. Maybe at the mouth of the Columbia River. I see Jefferson doing cartwheels through the White House. You can read today what Jefferson wrote him, and here's a quote. I will give you all the support the executive branch can provide. Period. Close quote. Jefferson was desperate for an American entity to get back to the mouth of the Columbia River and build a permanent trading post. So the War of 1812, remember, we lose Fort Astoria. An English warship arrives there and takes it. The end of the treaty in 1815, that ends our War of 1812. Each side was supposed to give all the properties back. Well, the English were a little dilatory in giving us Fort Astoria back. They were calling it Fort George. So President James Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams send an American naval captain and an American diplomat to go to the mouth of the Columbia River, and I can quote you this too. The orders that John Quincy Adams wrote out for this naval captain was to, by, quote, some symbolic means reassert the United States ownership of the Oregon country. Some symbolic means. So did the guy walk ashore with a cross and a flag? Almost. He arrives at the north side of the mouth of the Columbia River, and he calls Chinook Indians together to watch this. The French were famous for calling the Indians together to proclaim to them how important the French were. Gosh, Lewis and Clark did the same thing, didn't they? Didn't they hold over 50 conferences, 2- and 3-day conferences with Indian tribes when they came across the continent? What did they tell the tribes? You can read that today. Most of you have the journals at home. Turn to August the 4th, 1804, and you can see what Lewis told the Otoe and Missouri Indians, the first official tribal conference that they had. 2,500 word speech. Lewis wrote it out later. Children, we are your new great white father. They handed out the Jefferson Peace Medals. I'm pretty sure most of you have seen pictures of those. What was the Peace Medal for? Here is your new father. Pay attention to what he says, and things will go well with you. If you ignore him, he will crush you. He will close his, I'm giving you quotes fast, folks. He will close his hand and crush you. He will consume you like the fire consumes the grass of the prairie. Welcome, guys. Glad you could come by. Folks, Lewis and Clark, as you well know, looked like just a couple more Europeans to most of the tribes. Most of these tribes have been trading with the Spanish and the Hudson's Bay Company and English and French traders for decades before Lewis and Clark showed up. To the tribal side, Lewis and Clark were just a couple of more merchants out in the field to sell some goods. And then they're telling us, your children, do what I say or we might just kill you. No, I'm glad to have you. Okay, I got really sidetracked, didn't I? I can do that. So let's talk a little more. What did discovery do to Indian tribes, folks? Here's what the United States Supreme Court said. The reason they set out that long history that I talked to you about is where the court was describing what the basis of law was in North America for making claims against Indian tribes, indigenous people, and buying their lands. The court held, and this is the law today in the United States, tribal land rights were immediately limited the moment Europeans showed up. That flag and that cross meant, oh, I know now what I forgot to finish my story. After that American naval captain calls all the Chinook to watch him at the mouth of the Columbia River, he takes a shovel out, folks, and he turns some dirt. That is I see a law student over here whose mouth just gaped open from property law, and there's another law student and a property law professor. It was called delivery of seizin. Back in 1200 England, and 1300 England, and 1400 England, you know how you proved you had sold property to someone? If you and I agreed you were going to buy my land, we'd go on the land, we'd yell to the neighbors to watch, and I'd turn a little dirt and hand you a dirt clod. Or I'd hand you a branch or a twig off the property. That was called delivery of season. That's how we proved we'd sold the property. So what does this American naval captain do at the mouth of the Columbia? Chinook, people watch this, turns a little dirt, reads a proclamation, and hangs a sign up. A sign, folks. This territory belongs to the United States. He then sails past Fort Astoria on the south side of the Columbia. I mean, he's smart. He's touching all his bases. And he calls Indians in there, and he does the same process. The American diplomat showed up a month later, and the English cooperated with him. They had been ordered to cooperate with this symbolic reassumption of ownership of Oregon. So the American diplomat walks into Fort Astoria. The British all get their troops there, and they blow their whistle, and they lower the English, the Union Jack. They raise the American flag. Boom, boom. The American guy breaks a bottle of wine across the flagpole. They lower it, and he sails away. Tells the President of the United States, did what you told me to do. Reasserted America's symbolic ownership in the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon country. Wow. Okay, so what did it do to Indian people, though? Limited their real property rights. Real property is a fancy word for land. Tribes could not sell their land to whomever they wished for whatever amount of money they could negotiate. They could only sell their land to the European or American country that had discovered it, or that now owned the discovery rights. Something else happened to tribes, too. Just because they were discovered, they lost some sovereign rights, some governmental powers. They could now they were not supposed to trade with any other country but the one European or American government that held the discovery right. They were not supposed to sign treaties with any country. So they no longer had an international diplomatic presence. Their sovereign rights were limited. Now, all this was done without their permission, without their consent, without them being paid anything. Normally, we'd say that's ridiculous. It is ridiculous, except the United States has big guns, right? The United States was able to enforce this law against Indian people. Indian people, you can read stuff from the 1750s, the 1760s, where tribal chiefs were telling the British and the English, your disputes between you guys has nothing to do with us, our rights, our land. Tribes understood these claims were being made against them. They were incredulous. But ultimately, these things were enforced on Indian people. So now that you know this, that the tribe couldn't sell their land to whomever they wished, who won this lawsuit? Mr. McIntosh, right? Mr. Johnson's grandfather in 1773, the tribes had lost the property right to sell their land to whomever they wished for the best price they could negotiate. The tribes could only sell their lands to the government that held this power of discovery. Now, do you know what they called it back then? And the word Jefferson used. Jefferson never used the word doctrine of discovery because that phrase comes from this case in 1823. Jefferson called this preemption. Our very first Congress in 1790, that act I referred you to a while ago, that no tribe or Indian could sell their lands without the permission of the United States, that act also uses the word preemption. So that very act in 1790 was referring to this international law principle and the fact that tribes and Indian people had lost some of their property rights just because Europeans showed up. So McIntosh wins this case, Johnson loses out completely. But guess who, there was no tribe as a party in this case, was there? Guess who really lost out? Tribal people, indigenous people. This doctrine was used around the world, in Africa, in South America, of course, even in Asia. Do you remember the show Shogun? Richard Chamberlain? When he and those Dutch ships show up in the Japans, what do the Portuguese tell them? We own this, you have no right to come here, go away. Why did the Portuguese claim they owned the Japans? Because the Pope drew that line in 1493 and granted Portugal the world. Wow. That's still a law today? I know some Indian people that have tried to talk with the Vatican about withdrawing these papal bulls. The Episcopal Diocese of Maine has asked the Queen of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury to withdraw the charter that was given John Cabot in 1496. The Queen wrote back and said, I passed your letter on to the Archbishop. So far, the Archbishop hasn't said anything. We'll see what happens. Okay, let's see. Where do we go? Now, let me just say one thing, folks. Oh, well, I want several things. Thomas Jefferson was still alive when this case was decided. You can today use a computer to search everything he's written. So, of course, I wanted to know if he wrote anything about this. He and John Adams were writing lots of letters to each other in their declining years. Jefferson does not refer to this case at all. Now, I, of course, interpret it in favor of my own position, so let's see what you think of this. The case was no surprise to Thomas Jefferson, so he didn't write anything. Now, had he been shocked by it, don't you think he might then have written about it? He and John Adams did write about Chief Justice John Marshall. He was Jefferson's fourth cousin. Jefferson hated his guts. He criticized Marshall to John Adams in this long series of letters they wrote each other the last decade or so of their life. It doesn't mention Johnson in advertising. The way I interpret that is that's because he agreed with it. That's because he understood it. Now I'm going to prove to you that he did. In 1792, as I told you, Jefferson is Secretary of State, our first Secretary of State. He has a conversation with the English ambassador, Sir George Hammond, about forts that the English still have soldiers in south of the Great Lakes. The Hudson's Bay Company is still there, taking furs as fast as they can because they know they're going to be boosted out. So Jefferson's having this delicate little meeting with the ambassador to try to get the English to withdraw. So they have a conversation that I can quote you quite a bit on. Jefferson was the writingest president we've ever had. You can read the notes he compiled to prepare himself for the conversation. You can then read his notes of the conversation after he met with the ambassador, and then you can read the letter he wrote to the ambassador, reiterating what they had talked about. Well, he sounds like a lawyer. Well, oh gosh, yeah, he was a lawyer. For 7 years, Jefferson practiced law, and half his cases were about title to land, about Indian titles, how the early colonists got there. Jefferson knew all about how you acquired Indian titles. He wrote lots about it, about how Virginia had done it, etc. So now he's having this conversation with the British ambassador. And he's delicately suggesting that the English have to get out of that territory south of the Great Lakes. And Sir George Hammond plays dumb, and he goes, well, why, sir, what are your rights vis-a-vis the Indians? This is, quote, Jefferson goes, why, we have the right of preemption over them. And the British ambassador pretends, what's preemption? Duh. And Jefferson goes, why, sir, we are the only country with the right to buy their lands. We're the only country that can deal with them, the only country that can trade with them. You've got to get your soldiers and your traders out of that area. Well, what I just quoted to you, folks, what does this look like? Jefferson knew that tribes had limited property rights. He used the phrase preemption. Only the United States could buy lands from these tribes. Only the United States could trade with these tribes and sign treaties. Then when Jefferson is president, you can read dozens of times he repeated these identical principles. Chiefs would visit him in the White House quite often, folks. We forget today how important Indian affairs were to the United States in the first 4 or 5 decades of our existence. England and France, they were several thousand miles away. They weren't too much of a risk, but there were thousands of warriors that might become hostile inside our original 13 states and on our borders. We had to placate Indian tribes. We had to deal with Indian tribes. So our presidents met with them all the time. If you read the annual messages that Washington and Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they talked about Indian issues to the Congress all the time. So Jefferson meets with chiefs in the White House. He writes them letters. What does he tell them? Your lands are your lands as long as you want to keep them. But if you ever want to sell them, you can only sell them to us. Not to a foreigner, not to a foreign government, not to an American citizen. Only to us. The Jefferson administration signed 8 treaties that you can read today, folks, and that identical principle is in the treaty. The tribe will only, if the tribe ever consents to sell, it'll be only the United States, no one else. So I hope I've convinced you that this opinion didn't surprise Jefferson at all. he just called the title preemption. I mean, what does preemption mean? You sat in this chair, I can't sit in that till you leave. You have some rights to that I don't have. So what Jefferson meant is by having the discovery power, the preemption power, the United States could keep any other country from dealing with our Indians. And that's literally what Jefferson told the ambassador. These are our Indians. Okay, I don't even know what slide's next, so what are we going to talk about? Oh, we've already been talking about some of this. This is the evidence I then found. So once I thought, well, let's find out what Jefferson knew about discovery, I got to read his 20-volume set of writings. I got to read, oh my gosh. Now you can search it by computer. I was just a couple years too early. I had to read it. These are the things Jefferson knew about discovery. Oh, folks, we make the Louisiana Purchase. The summer of 1804, Jefferson spends at home at Monticello. He writes a 40-page booklet that you can read today, trying to decide how big the Louisiana Territory was. How do you think he determines the size of it? Where had the French gone? When had the French found the mouth of the Mississippi River? Now, I got to go back to the map, folks. Look at the shape of the Louisiana Territory. Have you ever thought it's kind of funny looking? Maybe you know this already, but what is it? It's the western drainage system of the Mississippi River. What did Jefferson tell Lewis to do? Find the northernmost tributary. What was he doing? I'm now blanking on Cutbank Creek, right? Wasn't when he was up at Cutbank, isn't that when he ran into the Blackfeet young guys? He was searching. He spent a week up there hoping for the skies to clear so he could do all that stuff with the sextant to figure out how far north they were. Why? He was trying to figure out how big the Louisiana Territory was. So Jefferson spends the summer of 1804 debating where the Arkansas River goes, where the Red River goes, how much of what's now Texas we now had a claim to, all based on the French finding the mouth of the Mississippi River first. See, I had a Freudian slip there, but you see why I slipped, right? Now you know why Jefferson was so fixated on the mouth of the Columbia River. Look at the shape of the Oregon Country. It's the drainage system of the Columbia River. And we claimed it all. Do you remember James K. Polk's slogan when he ran for president? 54-40 or fight? What was he talking about? I bet the average, no American knows what that means. Really, probably. The 54th parallel. Clear up into modern-day British Columbia. And I guess we were allegedly going to fight a war with England over that because of the doctrine of discovery, because of the elements of the discovery doctrine. So now we got to rush back through all this. Oh, here's where Jefferson would laugh if he was alive today, folks. And so I took that back so I could set it up for him. Late in his 8 years in office, he writes 5 letters to the Congress, so you can read the letters today. He tells the Congress, you know, I've been softening the Indians up. They think we like them now. I think it's time we can buy some more land from them. And he says, in fact, it's time to buy some land on the west side of the Mississippi from the Now maybe I'm interpreting this too much, so you tell me if you agree with me. And I looked that word up in the Oxford English Dictionary to be sure it meant in 1808 what it means to us today. Jefferson thought the tribes west of the Mississippi were the proprietors of their lands, owners. In fact, do you know that he thought the Louisiana Treaty was unconstitutional? And he drafted a constitutional amendment that he thought was required to make the Louisiana Purchase constitutional. His cabinet members, James Madison, Levi Lincoln, I forget the other 2 people, convinced him not to go public with the fact that he thought the Louisiana Treaty was unconstitutional. But in the actual document that Jefferson drafted in his own hand, he would have guaranteed to the tribes west of the Mississippi the occupancy of the lands and their self-government. He knew that these tribal people west of the Mississippi, even though they were in this area that the United States had allegedly bought from France, that these tribes still had property rights to land and sovereign self-governance rights. He knew who he was dealing with, that these were governmental people, nation of nations, that Europeans had always dealt with. And he was going to put that in our Constitution to ratify the Louisiana Treaty. Native proprietors. So if he was alive today, I think he might chuckle at Stephen Ambrose and all those historians that say we bought Louisiana for $15 million. In fact, folks, let me tell you, what did we really pay for Louisiana? Do you know? When we really came to buy the title from the tribes, what did we pay? Well, one very famous law professor in 1947, Felix Cohen, calculated roughly what he thinks the United States paid the tribes for the title to the land, $300 million. So we didn't just pay $15 million. So what did we buy from France? An option. An option to buy the land if and when the tribes ever chose to sell. That's what Jefferson told them in the White House. That's what Johnson v. McIntosh tells us. That's what we bought, folks. I mean, I don't know how much you know about property law, but if you negotiate with your neighbor, you can sign an option for a right of first refusal. You can say, I'll pay you $100 today, let's sign a contract. If you ever choose to sell your house, you'll offer it to me first. That's an option for a right of first refusal. Now, if you pay them a lot of money, you might get them to sign an agreement that if they ever sell, they will sell it only to you. That's the doctrine of discovery. That's what Jefferson, that's what George Washington, that's what other presidents, that's what Secretary of States told Indian tribes. If you ever want to sell, you can only sell it to us because we hold this right of preemption that we now today call the doctrine of discovery. Okay, we already covered that. Oh, let me take that back too. When Jefferson sends Meriwether Lewis forth, he had requested passports from the English, French, and Spanish ambassadors. He lied to them about what the expedition was about. So maybe this gets to the conniving part. maybe this is the devious part. And you can put this together like a jigsaw puzzle, folks. It's interesting. When Jefferson sends a secret message January the 18th, 1803 to the Congress, and he's requesting federal monies to send 10 or 12 men across the continent. And you'll find this funny. He requests $2,500. The expedition costs $38,500. Just the 15 times over, right? That's nothing in the federal system, right? But anyway, what does he tell the Congress we're going to do? We're going to cross the continent searching for a water route for commerce. We're going to talk to the Indian tribes and start American trade with them for commerce. And we're going to steal the fur trade from that other country that uses that frozen bay to the north. What other country was he talking about? Well, Hudson's Bay and England. But even in a secret message to Congress, he was afraid to name the country he was trying to steal the fur trade from. Now, read the letters to the British, French, and Spanish ambassadors when he asks for passports for Meriwether Lewis. He goes, oh, this is going to be a scientific frolic through the woods. We're going to look for new flora and fauna. And, oh, we'll do a map. That'll be good for all of us. Well, I guess the British and French ambassadors were kind of stupid, so they kind of believed him. But the Spanish ambassador says, no way, I'm not giving you a passport. And do you folks know that the Spanish sent 4 military expeditions to capture Lewis and Clark? You know Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, Pike's Peak? Jefferson sent him out other directions to find how big Louisiana was. The Spanish grabbed Lieutenant Zebulon Pike and held him for a month or so before they gave him a swift kick to send him back to the U.S. Okay, what was I setting up? Meriwether Lewis leaves Washington, D.C. about June the 20th, 1803, with passports in hand, thinking he might cross territories that the English and French were claiming. Louisiana Purchase happens about July the 4th. Jefferson doesn't know anything about it until July the 3rd or July the 4th of 1804. The American officials had only been authorized to buy New Orleans and only authorized to pay up to $2 million. All of a sudden, Napoleon says, take it all, $15 million. And they agreed. That was twice the federal budget at the time. Can you explain why it was a little controversial? Why Jefferson was a little frightened? But now he writes Meriwether Lewis a new letter of instructions. There are at least 3 Jeffersonian letters of instructions to Jefferson, and he sets out these 4 objectives of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the only one I think most of us were taught in school is the 3rd one, the scientific side of it, Jefferson's interest in flora and fauna. That's all I can remember being taught in 4th and 5th grade. These geopolitical grab territory, open the trade with the Indian tribes, and throw the English out. I wasn't taught that in the 5th grade. But here's what Jefferson now writes to Meriwether Lewis, who's spending the winter in the St. Louis area. He writes him a letter that says, you really don't need those passports anymore. He says, I've got to give you some news. And I think this was January 20, 1804. January 20, 1804. So you can read this letter. And he says, you don't need those passports anymore. I got to tell you, we've concluded this Louisiana purchase with France, and now we have the rights to the whole area. But look what this one sentence shows he still understood the tribal rights to be. This looks like the Doctrine of Discovery to me. Maybe I see the Doctrine of Discovery everywhere these days. You know, tea leaves in the bottom of my cup of tea. We are now the sovereigns of the country. And he's talking about the Louisiana Territory. But these rights, and this is still in the same sentence, our rights that we've acquired are subject to the Indian rights of occupants. So he understood exactly what the tribal rights still were. That's why he called them the native proprietors. But he said they're now kind of under our sovereignty. We are the sovereigns of this Louisiana territory. The French and the Spanish were gone. That's the other thing Lewis and Clark told the Indians. I forgot to quote that. In that stock speech that they gave to more than 50 tribal conferences, besides the children's stuff, besides we're here to trade with you, besides listen to Jefferson or we'll kill you, he also told them, your old fathers, the French and the Spanish, have sailed across that great shining sea, never to return. You've got to deal with us. Okay, what did Lewis and Clark do? Well, I've already referenced the speeches. Go home, look it up. Read what Meriwether Lewis and what Clark said to the tribal chiefs. We're here, we're your sovereigns. Listen to us, do what we say, and things will be hunky-dory. They handed out what are called sovereignty tokens. This isn't my phrase. This is what historians call the Jefferson Peace Medals that they handed out, the American flags that they handed out, the American military uniforms that they gave to chiefs. And other historians, not me, people like Clay Jenkinson and stuff, say that when these chiefs wore or put these objects on, or literally flew the American flag in front of their teepee or wigwam or whatever, Lewis and Clark thought, well, they've accepted us. They agreed. What did Indian people think? Some of the people gave these objects away. That's bad. I don't even want that. But, you know, from our side, we thought they had agreed to our sovereignty. Why did Lewis and Clark build the forts they did? They nearly froze their butts off, right, in North Dakota, 40 below zero. They're in a drafty fort. Why didn't they live in a nice, warm lodge, earthen lodge, with the very friendly Mandan people? Out in my country, it rained every day but 3 while they were there. Now, I don't want to discourage you from tourism. It's real nice now. But at the Oregon coast, it rains a little bit. Their elkskin clothes rotted off. Why didn't they move just 75 miles up the Columbia? You're in the Dalles. It's dry most of the time. And why didn't they then live with the friendly Chinook people and Clatsop people in a 100-foot long, 40-foot wide cedar longhouse? They'd have been dry. No, they built a fort. Because, folks, building forts was the #1 way Europeans proved where they had been. Have some soldiers there, fly a flag. How long do you think a fort lasts? The remains of Fort Clatsop were still there in the 1853. Some professor was led around the site by a local farmer and shown the remains of Lewis and Clark's fort. Those notes are at the Oregon Historical Society. They built a fort because it was permanent. It was a lot better than sticking a flag and a cross in the sand or nailing up a sign that the Indians probably took down the moment you turned your back. That sign that guy's nailed up was lead, so you think the Indians melted that and made bullets out of it or something? Thanks for the metal, guy. So Lewis and Clark knew what they were doing. And when I first started all this research, I knew the little schooling that Lewis and Clark had. relatively uneducated, just a few years of official schooling. And so I thought, well, they might not know that history of the Pope doing this and that and the claims of lands. But let me tell you, when I get done, the clincher that they knew what they were doing. Lewis's branding iron, we already talked about that. Here is the piece de resistance. If I was in front of the world court trying to prove that the United States owned the Oregon Country, this would be exhibit number 1. This is a document that Lewis and Clark wrote, and they hung in Fort Clatsop when they left. On the back of the piece of paper, it's a list of the names of the 33 people that went with it. And they drew a rough map, how they went up the Missouri, across the Rockies, Clearwater, Snake River, Columbia. And then on the front, they write this paragraph. And I'm going to let you read it because it's a little long. But if this isn't the doctrine of discovery and Lewis and Clark claiming the Oregon Country, I don't know what is. So, here you go. The list is the 33 names. The object of this list is what? I'm not even going to try to interpret it. They tell you what it is. It's so that some civilized person. What does that mean? That's sure not the Chinook or Clatsop Indians, is it? But it's so that some European can find this document and can tell the informed world that a United States military party crossed the continent, lived at the coast, and guess where? The mouth of the Columbia River. Now, Lewis and Clark hung some of these in the fort, and they gave copies to the chiefs. And they said, if any European, anyone, any white man, they said, shows up, give this to them. European ships had already been appearing in the mouth of the Columbia from 96 forward. When Lewis and Clark got close to the mouth of the Columbia River, do you remember the first Chinook Indian they saw? He was wearing a British pea jacket, a naval jacket. They saw one Indian woman with a white guy's name tattooed on her arm, and they ran into one 6-foot-tall, red-head Clatsop Indian. Who's your dad? Yeah, who's your daddy? Yeah, who's your dad? Okay. Folks, have I convinced you? Do you know that one of these documents almost beat Meriwether Lewis back to the East Coast? Do you know also why they hung out at the mouth? They hung out at the mouth of the Columbia River for another reason. Jefferson had instructed Lewis to wait for a ship, find a ship, and send 2 men and a separate copy of the journals home that way. Jefferson was smart. I mean, Lewis and Clark might have fallen in the Grand Canyon, right? The Teton Sioux might have killed them on the return. So make multiple copies. So they waited that dreadfully wet winter, and then they finally left this object and they went home. Now, before I forget, so I think Lewis and Clark knew what the doctrine of discovery was. I think that it's pretty plain they understood what they were doing when they were writing their names on stuff. And the absolute piece de resistance of evidence, folks, is little Private Joseph Whitehouse. Remember I told you he wrote a journal too. His last entry, December the 10th, 1806, he's closing his journal and he says, I hope that from our journey it's recognized that the United States owns the Oregon Country. Now those of you who just bought my hardback book, I hate to tell you, that's not in the hardback. I found that later. So that's in a 2-page addendum to the paperback. I continue to find new stuff. I mean, I know that I had 3 research assistants and we did this research for 3 years, but I know we didn't find a fraction of the evidence that shows how our federal government understood the doctrine of discovery, used these arguments. And let me show you with the next slide then. How did we finally prevail over England and come to own? I'll skip this stuff for time. Our claims to the Oregon Country, the entire drainage system of the Columbia River, were based on finding it first. Robert Gray named it. Lewis and Clark traversing the entire continent east to west and living those 3 or 4 months at the mouth, building Fort Clatsop. and then John Jacob Astor building Astoria in 1811. Now, if you want to go online now, you can read what are called the American State Papers, and you can read letter after letter from our presidents, our vice presidents, our secretaries of state, back and forth with various English lords and ministers arguing over who owns the Oregon country. They claimed Francis Drake found the Columbia in 1550. They just didn't have any proof of it. They then said, well, Captain James Cook must have found it in 1770. Didn't have any proof of that. They claimed the Hudson's Bay Company had been making its way down the Columbia River for a decade before we ever got here. But remember, it was finding the mouth of a river that's important, not the headwaters. And they claimed that they had occupied the Oregon country with the Hudson's Bay Company and John McLaughlin at Vancouver, Washington. And we argued, you can read letter after letter after letter after letter, back and forth. They were arguing, and this is a quote, public international law. Well, what public international law were they talking about? Preemption, discovery. We ultimately, this is why we claimed we owned it, and ultimately both countries agreed on that 49th parallel, and we drew the line where it is. So we didn't go to war over 54, 40, or 5. I guess James K. Polk was just talking smack, right? Okay, I don't even know. This may be the last slide. I don't know. Oh, let me just close with this. The longest chapter in my book is about manifest destiny. And I try to prove, and I think convincingly so, that manifest destiny also comes directly from those elements of the doctrine of discovery that I blew by because we're getting long. Manifest destiny as a word was used in 1845 by a New York editor. And he claimed that we owned Texas because of manifest destiny. He then used the word in an editorial in December of 1845 that the United States owns the Oregon country because it is our manifest destiny to spread across this continent and own it. Now, these are the three elements of manifest destiny that historians use. This is not from me, folks. What is manifest destiny? We have some special virtue, our governments, our court, whatever. It's our mission to redeem and remake the world in our image, and we're doing it under God's divine destiny, or direction. This is what historians tell you manifest destiny is. Now, does that sound like the doctrine of discovery? When a European walks ashore with two little poles and claims an entire continent. Wow. Folks, I appreciate very much you coming. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions and delighted to sell any books. You were first?
It seems to me, just listening to you, that the doctrine of discovery, manifestation, is still alive. I don't know how well it is throughout the world, in the guise of American bases.
American what?
Bases.
Oh, bases.
Military bases around the world. Is that doctrine still in operation out there? You just don't hear about it?
Well, that's why I love that Russia putting its flag at the Arctic, because it still is. I think we just didn't assume there were any new vacant spots in the world to claim, right? But we found one. Far be it from me to say anything, but the guy that wrote the foreword in this book, my series editor, he used George Bush's name and he used Iraq, and he attached the doctrine of discovery to that. I stay, 20 feet away from that topic. So don't quote me on that topic.
My name is John Collier. I'm the American Program Coordinator at Travelers Rest Park. My question is, how did they deal with, after coming over the Rockies and into the Plateau country with language? And how did that go down the coast? Because I know that by the time they had left Montana and gotten down on the Columbia, that their sign language was no good. That the people out there didn't use sign language. They used the Wawa, the Chinook jargon. And I just wonder, did the native people even know what the world they were talking about or have a clue?
It's the same old story of even negotiating treaties, is it? Because we don't really know what tribal people understood about the language of a treaty. The United States kept minutes, said allegedly what they said, but when a translation goes through 3 or 4 languages, what happens, folks? Any teachers here, you play that telegraph with your kids in the 5th grade, and the story here isn't even the same. You know, you whisper the story to each other, and it's not the same. Oh, wow. It's not even the same as the story down here. Let me brag about Shawnee. See, I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. The most important person on the Lewis and Clark expedition was George Drew York. Okay, maybe he was third to Lewis and Clark. But he was half Shawnee and half French. He could speak 4 or 5 Indian languages, and he was their main sign language interpreter. But like you say, how do we know what was spoken and what was understood? When Lewis and Clark said, "We're your new fathers," and when they called Indians children, if I was some powerful chief or a powerful warrior, children, what are you talking about? So we had the faintest idea. Let me tell you something that when you asked, this just reminded me. Jefferson thought there was a tribe in the interior of North America that spoke Welsh. The English thought that a Prince Madoc had come over here in 1105 and started his own Indian tribe. Do you know that was still in American school books in the early, till like 1910 and stuff? Now, why do you think the English came up with that story? First in time, why did the English claim Francis Drake must have found the mouth of the Columbia River? They were trying to prove claims. Lewis and Clark expected to run into a Welsh-speaking tribe, and at first they thought the Mandans were. That's in the journals. Then they thought the Salish were, because the Salish, I've never heard Salish spoken, but I guess they have an interesting click or something. And the men wrote in their journals, "We found the Welsh tribe." No kilts, they aren't wearing kilts. What's wrong? Maybe they thought a breechcloth wasn't. But what was understood, we have no idea. Sign language, why did they hire, was it Francois Charbonneau and Sacagawea at Fort Mandan? Because she could speak Shoshone and he could speak a couple Mandan, and so they thought they took some interpreters. You certainly.
You said that you've been in Australia. Did you get inputs, insights into how they treated the Aborigines, and was it similar to what the U.S. did?
Absolutely. Letter to letter. Folks, I knew that Indian lost, certainly in these 4 European, English colonies, Australia, New Zealand, France, and Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. Indian law and policy, very similar. Doctrine of discovery used in all 4 countries. Australia, I've been there now 2 years in a row to various conferences in Australia, and boy, what was James Cook? Who discovered their continent? James Cook. At where? Discovery Bay. What did he do? Stuck his flag in the soil and shot his gun at a couple of natives who charged him with a spear. I guess they didn't want him there, but England based their entire claim to the entire continent of Australia. Let me just go back very quickly. I break the doctrine of discovery down into 10 constituent elements. I've never seen anyone do this before. Johnson v. McIntosh obviously been written about a lot. It's an important case. There's books galore. But no one has ever broken it down into what I call the basic elements of it. And so terra nullius is the one that was used in Australia. That's a Latin word, earth, empty, null and void. So the Europeans claimed Australia was empty. Well, it is a pretty forbidding climate. I think you need lots of land to survive on. And so the Europeans thought the land was empty. We use that here in the United States too, folks. The United States Supreme Court used this phrase twice in cases. We acted as if the land was empty, and we took it. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court said. So these elements are what I think make up the doctrine of discovery. We've talked about most of them. Contiguity is how big the area you claim. So that's the finding the mouth of a river. That's why Louisiana Territory had that shape. That's why the Oregon country has that shape.
So, at some point in history past, group of people, Europeans, developed a culture, ideas, a religion, or they formed those things together and decided to figure out a way to conquer the world, because they had a right to, because the people out there didn't have the same rights as they had, and didn't have a plan to come over and do it to them. So it's just somebody that had a fantasy or an idea, and they had the power, and so they did it. Conquered the world. And it's still legal. It's still.
You encapsulated my book. Well, folks, this is, I teach law, I teach a first-year course, and we're not supposed to tell first-year law students, we don't want to jade them too quickly. What is law? That's what you were just talking about. We call this international law. How? Why? We talk about natural law. What is natural law? I mean, most societies, murder and incest, they're taboo, right? I guess we would call that natural law. Those are rights you have as just being a human being. But the international doctrine of discovery is not a natural law right. It's something somebody made up, and ultimately it's something someone enforced with guns. Chief Justice John Marshall and his colleague on the court, who was 34 years on the court, Joseph Story, both wrote that we enforced this doctrine by the sword. And maybe I'm telling you a secret, but law is enforced always by this sword. Why do we drive the speed limit out here? Because a cop with a gun on his hip can pull us over, write us a ticket, you get enough tickets, you lose your driver's license. You continue to drive, you go to jail. So, there's 2 law students here, you guys plug your ears. Law is this wonderful ephemeral thing that we all believe in. Some of it you have to use a gun to enforce.
You talked about the deal where no man was gone before. They carried that into the Star Trek movies.
Oh, where no man is. How come he always found alien life forms out
Had
there?
to go where no man had gone before, and that's just been carried down from.
Did you all hear did you hear back there? It wouldn't have been much a show if there had really not been anyone there, though, would it? So everywhere he went, there was someone. Other questions, folks?
Was the Crusades a result of this doctrine of discovery?
Thank you for that question. If you really want to research where the doctrine of discovery came from, in my book I just cover how it developed in the first chapter pretty quickly. What I'm mostly focusing on is how it came here, how our colonies used it, then how our states used it, and how the federal government used it, and how Jefferson and Lewis and Clark used it, and how we used it. The best book that I know of on how it developed in Europe, and they absolutely talk about the Crusades, is Rob Williams' book called The American Indian and Western Legal Thought. So he writes an entire 390-page book on how it developed in Europe. And he goes clear back to a pope from 400 AD. So but yes, the Crusades. What were the Crusades, folks? The way you worded it is exactly what it was. That European Christians had the right by force to go kill and take the Holy Lands. You know what they called that? That was for the defense of Christianity. Defense? You just traveled 800 miles to kill me. I wasn't threatening you. Do you know, and this became the idea of just war. And a very famous Spanish priest, Franciscus de Victoria, wrote in 1532 and gave speeches. He was advisor to Prince Philip V. He was the leading scholar at the leading university, I think, in the world at the time, University of Salamanca. And he wrote a series on the Indians lately discovered. And he was talking about what were Spain's rights in the New World. And he wrote that we can wage just war against them if, and he lists this series of things, that if Indians stopped the Spanish from traveling wherever they wanted to go, from taking whatever they wanted to take, and from preaching the gospel, then the Spanish could kill the Indians. Just war. We have the phrase just war, folks, in a law that our Congress passed in 1787 called the Northwest Ordinance. We said we would never take Indian property rights without their consent, except in a just and lawful war. Who decided whether it was just and lawful? We then applied, our Congress in 1846 applied that Northwest Ordinance of 1787 to the Oregon country. So this idea of just war was very much a part of American life, American law also. Folks, I don't want to take so many questions, there's no time to sell books. Thank you very much for coming. I'm selling them up here.